Why hello there, and welcome back to Tabletop Ferox. And in this episode, something very special. Furry Outlaws was released in 1995 by Furry Games. A lot of sources say 94, as does the copyright notice in the book, but several of the art pieces are signed with 95, and it makes much more sense that the copyright notice would be for the text of the book than that the illustrations would for some reason be post-dated. And this is basically, as far as I can tell, the second furry role-playing game after Albedo. Yeah, there are considerably fewer furry role-playing games than you might think, especially older ones, which is weird given the similarities between the furry fandom and the tabletop gaming community. And what is special about this game is that while there was a successor to it in Furry Pirates, it happens to be a game that I just kind of thought I would never have an opportunity to check out, because it was self-published in 1995 and is so rare that I've never even heard of anyone having a copy. But then, a little while ago, I was on the Fur Affinity, and someone messaged me and asked if I was going to cover Furry Outlaws and Furry Pirates. And I was right in the middle of replying, maybe Furry Pirates, but no chance on Outlaws because it is impossible to find, when I thought, you know what, why don't I take another look around the internet, and I found that some dedicated archivist had tracked down a copy of the game, purportedly by finding and contacting the artist of the book, and then scanned it and uploaded it to the Internet Archive so that anyone can go and enjoy it. That's why the Internet Archive is such an important resource for weirdos like me who make videos about classic furry role-playing games. Like, you know, there's actual good reasons for it too, it's just my reasons for it are kind of silly. And Furry Outlaws was released as a 108-page comb-bound book. And just for clarity, because a lot of people make this mistake with this book and a lot of the older Tunnels and Trolls books, as well as just anything that is bound this way, this is comb binding, not spiral binding. And of the two, comb binding is, and especially was, significantly cheaper, especially in a small-scale production. You know, like an in-home operation, or your local Kinko's. Back, you know, when Kinko's was a thing. Hey, remember Kinko's? Am I relatable now? Because keep in mind, there was no Mix'em or Print Ninja back then. If you wanted to print a book, your options were to just staple it like the first few editions of Tunnels and Trolls, or go with comb binding, like the 4th edition of Tunnels and Trolls and Furry Outlaws. Which arguably makes this a zine, because as I keep pointing out, zine is not a format or an aesthetic, it is an independently produced publication. But enough of me rambling on about various types of book binding. Yeah, this video has a binding ramble in it. Let's get into the Furry Outlaws. Because when furry is outlawed, only outlaws will be furries. So, as you may have guessed, this game is heavily inspired by Disney's Robin Hood, which, it might surprise you to learn, is just a wee bit popular with furries. And as such is more or less set in 12th century furry England. Like, very much 12th century England. Like, the phrase furry Christendom appears multiple times in this book. Unfortunately though, they do reference furry Christianity multiple times without ever telling you what kind of animal Jesus is, because if you are going to make Christianity a major part of your anthropomorphic animal setting, That is the question that everyone is going to have. Personally, the way I see it is that the church would depict Jesus as a lion, because that's also what the royal family are. But if you go back to earlier representations, they would be of donkeys. But the church would consider those earlier representations to be highly heretical. Thinking way too much about furry Jesus here. Now, unfortunately, I don't really know enough about medieval England to comment on how accurate or inaccurate or interestingly altered the setting is. I just must assume that certain parts are embellishments, like the dragons and undead and the Wizards Guild. But honestly, if there was a Wizards Guild in medieval England, I probably wouldn't know about it. So, no adjustment for setting. For one thing, I'm just not that interested in historical settings, but especially ones that add fantastical elements like dragons and undead and, I don't know, animal people, without putting much effort into making the setting reflect those changes, beyond some basic-ass ideas like, oh, a character's species is more or less equivalent to their ethnicity and social class. Also, they don't really do much to address the difference between anthropomorphic animals and regular animals, regularly referencing things like hunting deer and riding horses, while deer and horses are also people in the setting. And then also, like, magic. This is 12th century England, where witchcraft was kind of a big deal. And in this game, they just added magic and then said that, oh, well, the church is okay with it as long as it is the regulated magic from the Wizards Guild. But then also, witchcraft is still a crime, and it just feels like there was a lot of refusal to make creative choices for the setting, especially when those choices conflicted with the inspiration. And yeah, Disney's Robin Hood did not deal with any of this stuff either, but I expect more from furries than I do from Disney. Especially 1970s Disney. Characters in Furry Outlaws are, of course, anthropomorphic animal outlaws in 12th century furry England. And as with any anthropomorphic animal role-playing game, one of the biggest questions is, how are they going to deal with the whole anthropomorphic animals aspect? And they deal with it here by having 10 broad species categories: avian, canine, chiroptera, bats, feline, lapine, mustelidae, reptile, rodentia, ungulate, and ursoid. So we actually have 2 non-mammalian options, which is nice because there are usually 0, as Anthromedia does tend to overwhelmingly favor mammals. And then we also have 5 size categories: small, light, average, heavy, and extra large. And I do like to see the anthro animals separated by size versus something like Ironclaw, where a squirrel can be taller than a bear. So instead of having specific options, you just choose a species type and size category that most closely matches the animal you want to play. So instead of selecting fox, you select light canine, with the only restrictions being that some sizes are unavailable for certain species types. So you can be anything from a gecko to a saltwater crocodile, but not a dik-dik or a moa, which probably weren't extinct yet at the time. And it is specifically stated that player characters are not restricted to species normally found in the British Isles and Europe, because this is based on Disney's Robin Hood, and there were lots of non-native species in Disney's Robin Hood. Of course, they also then overlook things like marsupials and monotrains, because those were not in Disney's Robin Hood. And even go out of their way to specifically exclude primates, because an evolved primate is only a human being, which, boy, that just fails to understand a whole lot of things. But also, I feel like we had an entire series of movies about other evolved primates in fact being distinct from humans. Although, honestly, there is really nothing beyond the Game Master preventing you from playing as an anthroplatypus or chimp, because while this system does provide a lot of options, it also makes each of those options very indistinct. And by indistinct, I mean that with a couple exceptions, your choice of species does not actually matter at all. Birds and bats of small and light size can fly and glide respectively, and birds get to retain their talons, but other than those two, the only part of your species that has any mechanical effect on your character is your size, which gives inverse adjustments to strength and agility, which are also likely to not actually matter. Basically, they've done the lazy thing and nerfed all species down to a human level, specifically stating a lack of claws, superior sense of smell, and echolocation, and not even mentioning features like antlers, venom, or just sharper teeth than other animals. Also, no snakes. For some reason, they just took a very hard stance here that anthropomorphic animals should in no way function differently from each other or humans. Instead, your character's species more so reflects their social status in the setting. So, for example, felines are primarily nobility and royalty, mustelids are usually lower and middle class, and ungulates make up the bulk of the peasantry, although pigs are often middle class and horses are sometimes nobility. So, while a character's species may not have an impact on their stats and abilities, it is intended to inform a lot of their place in the game world. You might think. And we do have to select a species regardless of how unimportant it is, so let's go with Clydesdale, since I am just amused by the idea of a horse that can ride a horse, which would be an extra large ungulate. Then we need to choose a profession, and once again, these are provided in broad categories: fighting, magic, thievery, hunting, alchemy, crafts, and education. And if those don't really sound like professions to you, it's because they're not. They are the skill categories, they just decided to list the skill categories in a section and call it professions. And as far as I can tell, a profession provides no benefit or restrictions beyond some recommended restrictions on magic for all characters, because this is broken, so just don't let the players do it, is the sort of thing that is always a sign of a very well-designed game. So, I guess we need to choose a profession here, and let's just say that our character is a hedge witch, living outside of polite society, mixing up folk remedies and such, which would reasonably be a combination of alchemy and magic. Then we move on to history, which is why our character is an outlaw. A furry outlaw. And if you can't think of one, a fair number of sample events are provided, such as being framed for a crime, being caught in a compromising position with a member of another species. Yeah, that's a thing, and there's a whole section on it. Or not paying your taxes. And let's say that our character was seen in a compromising position with a lord's son or daughter. Or, both. Whatever. Also, remember how I mentioned that a character's species was primarily an indicator of their social status? Well, since all characters are intended to be outlaws, that makes their social status outlaw, which basically negates the only meaningful aspect of a character's species outside of aforementioned two who can fly. So let's just move on to abilities. We have 9 ability scores, 3 attack abilities, dexterity, ego, and strength, 3 defense abilities, agility, reason, and constitution, and 3 descriptive abilities, appearance, luck, and social. And we get 216 points to distribute between them, with a minimum of 3 and maximum of 30. And you might be thinking that's a lot of points to deal with, and that's because it is. Alternatively, we could just roll 3d10 for each of our ability scores, and usually I would go with the rolling option for funsies, but I might as well deal with all these points for the purpose of explaining how to deal with all these points, and also rolling will on average give you considerably lower ability scores. Like 216 divided by 9 is 24, and the average result of 3d10 is 16.5. Even if you up that to 4d10 drop lowest, it's still only 19.47. And you might be thinking, oh, well, they must have just not done the math on that. Silly them. But no, they absolutely understood this difference. It is stated that the average of 24 is appropriate for characters designed to be heroes, and that the mathematical average for the general population would be 16.5, though if survival of the fittest is taken into account, it's probably closer to 18 or 20, or, maybe like 19.47, which is both pretentious and dumb. But then, right after that, the book suggests rolling 3d10 or highest 3 of 4d10, seemingly unaware of the above section laying out all of those values as not being suitable for heroic characters, or even that there is a discrepancy between those three values. But let's just ignore that and get to the points. When faced with a large pool of points, the easiest thing to do is just make it into a small pool of points, which we can do by dumping a lot of them evenly into each attribute. So let's just go ahead and put 20 in every ability score, leaving us with 36 left over, which is a much more manageable number. But before we deal with those, let's just go ahead and add our size modifiers of +6 strength and -6 agility. However, remember how I said that those were likely to not actually matter? Well, let's just move 6 points from strength to agility, and there, they no longer matter. And I know you might be thinking that maybe the modifiers allow you to go outside of those normal 3 to 30 limits. And no, or well, kinda. Strength and agility, the ability scores that size modifies, actually have a maximum value of 36. But then also, if we must stay within those limits, and they accounted for adding 6 to the maximum roll of 30, you might be wondering what you are supposed to do if you are rolling, and roll lower than 9 on an ability score where you take a -6 penalty. And yeah, me too. The rules don't really even take into account scores above 36 or below 7. Technically, they can function with those values, excluding one notable thing, but they're clearly not intended to. And this is a thing that I will touch upon again when I get to that one notable thing. But for now, let's get to those remaining points. But, first, a horse is a horse, of course, so let's just put those size modifiers back for now. So we want our character to be able to handle alchemy and magic. And alchemy requires reason of 19 and social of 13, and magic requires reason 24 and social 19. So if you qualify for magic, you also qualify for alchemy. And we already have a high enough social score, so let's just put 5 points in reason. And alchemy also says that high scores in dexterity and constitution will help. Not sure how exactly, but those are also not bad abilities to put points into, and magic says that high ego is recommended, so 5 in each of those. And then we still have 16 points left, so let's just put 4 more each in dexterity, ego, agility, and luck. And there we go, 216 points, all spent very easily. Then we need to determine our overall level, which is set by the Game Master, and according to the book, 3rd level is the base for a mature furry, with 4th being in training, and 5th level is a character competent in their area of expertise. So I assume that should be the base for a competent adult character. Then we pull up the standard adjust table, which is a thing we are going to be using a lot. And at level 5, our standard adjust is 15. And that standard adjust is used to determine a whole bunch of things, like the experience points required to be a given level in any skill, the mana point cost of any given spell, and the experience points required to be a certain level overall, except that the numbers in the right-hand column are multiplied by 10. So to be level 5, we would need to have 150 experience points, and then to reach level 6, we would need to gain 60 more for a total of 210. And at this point, you might be noticing the math here. The standard adjust is just your cumulative level value, so 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 equals 15. And now that we have our standard adjust, we can calculate our primary attack and defense scores. Base defense is equal to the higher of luck, or 10, so 24. And that is basically unaware or helpless defense, so like if someone attacks you while you're sleeping. Unarmed defense is agility plus the standard adjust, so 33. Magic defense is reason plus standard adjust and another 10 for being a magic user, so 50. Poison defense is the higher of constitution, or 10, so 25. Healing attack is 50 minus constitution, so once again 25. Hit points are equal to the average of strength, constitution, and agility, so 23. And mana points equal to reason plus standard adjust, so 40. And obviously I will be explaining most of those things later, but for now, skills. And I'm just going to read this whole paragraph for you because it is a thing that is a problem, and I want you to know exactly the words I am reading here. When the GM decides what level the PCs will be when the game begins, she will assign the total number of experience points to be divided among the character's chosen skills. The standard adjust table indicates how many experience points the character has by overall level. Multiply left-hand figures by 10. It also indicates how many points it takes to be a certain level in any skill. So we look up our level of 5, and the left-hand column says 5, so 50 points. And you might be noticing a slight discrepancy here between the experience points required to be a certain overall level and the total number of experience points to be divided among the character's chosen skills. And yes, that very well could have been a typo. They could have accidentally said left hand instead of right hand and then missed it on every single proofreading and editing pass. That is unlikely, but possible. Either way, that is what the book says, and that is what I am going with, because I am reviewing the book, not the hypothetical perfect version of the game that never existed. And as stated, the standard adjust indicates how many points it takes to be a certain level in a skill, so taking level 4 Herbal Alchemy costs 10 points. 1 for level 1, 2 for level 2, 3 for level 3, and 4 for level 4. But the real notable thing here is that everything is a skill. Weapon proficiencies are skills, spells are skills, even skills are skills, and you need to spend those points on everything you want your character to do. So if you wanted to say learn magic, you have one pool of points that you need to spend on each individual spell rather than the broader skill set that other characters might have. So let's just spend the rest of those points and then move on to calculating our skill, attack, and defense scores. Yeah, you have to calculate a lot of stuff when you're making a character in this game, with the skill attack score being equal to the related ability score plus standard adjust for skill level, not character level, and then subtract that value from 50. And then if applicable, defense is equal to a related ability score plus the standard adjust plus 10, although as implied, not every skill has a defense. So our ambush skill attack uses our dexterity of 29, plus standard adjust of 6, since while we are a 5th level character, we only have the skill at 3rd, and then we subtract that value from 50 for 15 overall. And ambush defense is reason of 25, plus adjust of 6, plus 10 for 41 total. And then we do that for all of the other skills. And they do provide tables for attack and defense scores where you just cross-reference the ability score and skill level, which, given how simple that calculation is, feels like a less than entirely necessary use of all that page space. And finally, we just need to get our equipment, and for our starting funds, we need to look up our social score. And at 20, we are at the level of a struggling professional, and start with... Okay, so you know how sometimes games seem to go out of their way to be annoyingly historically accurate when they really don't have to because they contain fantastical elements like magic and dragons and, animal people, which makes dedication to realism kinda moot. And yet, they still bring in some historically accurate elements that make the game an objectively worse experience for their inclusion because, for some reason, they decided that this was one thing that could not be compromised on. Well, this funny animal game where we are making a magical horse uses pre-decimal British currency, so 12 pennies in a shilling and 20 shillings in a pound. A system that, of course, is so annoying that even the UK stopped using it in 1971. And for decades before that, it was considered just inevitable that they were going to move to a decimal system. And with our social score of 20, we start with 8d10 pounds for equipment. And this is where we hit a very low point in this game, because very few prices are given, mostly just for weapons and armor, and even fewer exact prices. Like, coarse clothing costs about a shilling. A crossbow starts at 30 shillings, with bolts costing about a farthing. A spear is anywhere from 3 to 15 shillings, alchemical herbs not more than a few pennies, and for jewels or really anything else not listed, a number of pennies equal to the item's value in 1994 dollars. So the prices of most items are going to boil down to ask the GM. And honestly, that sounds like an enormous inconvenience for all involved. Except the author, for whom it is very easy. And something that I just don't feel like dealing with right now because I am telling you how to make a character in this game, and the answer to how do I find the exact prices for my equipment is you don't. So this character is done. So that was character creation, and I have thoughts. You heard some of them, and I have many more. Just to start, I do like the species and size cross-reference table, because when it comes to a furry role-playing game, the number one question that your players are likely to have is, can I play as this animal? Admittedly, most of those are going to be wolves, but still it is convenient to be able to answer yes to that question. Unfortunately, all of that flexibility in choice of species, much like albedo before it, comes at the cost of distinctiveness for those species. In fact, even less so than albedo, because aside from aforementioned 2 species that can fly at the smallest size, your species has no mechanical impact on your character, only your size, and unless you are rolling your stats, size doesn't have to have an impact either. And just in general, for a game about anthropomorphic animals, it seems like they really went out of their way to avoid giving characters any kind of non-human abilities, right down to specifying that the anthropomorphic animals have fingernails instead of claws. Like, maybe it's just me, but if my character I am playing as is anything other than a human, I want that to have a meaningful impact on my experience and not just be something that I can basically forget about. But here, it feels like it's just something they didn't want to bother with. Like, it's not a bad character creation system. Like, it can make a guy, and that guy can be a badger, a fox, or a wolf. Not a snake, though, but it really feels like that guy could just as easily be a human, a dwarf, or an elf. Like, just in general, it feels like you could remove the word furry from the game without really impacting very much. Also, the skills, even if we do assume that you were meant to take the point value from the right-hand column, then you have a new problem in that your selection of skills is kinda lackluster. Like, if you aren't taking spells, you don't have a lot to spend your skill points on. Because you have combat skills, some other miscellaneous dungeoneering type things like hunting and thievery, and then they just kind of jump ahead to really specific profession skills like clerk and wainwright that are probably never going to be used. Like, if you want to focus on fighting and magic, that's okay, but if you wanted more of a well-rounded character, there aren't that many options provided for it. Like, no social skills, for example. Which actually is kind of addressed as, oh, well, you should just roleplay that, which, okay, you got me there, Furry Outlaws. You got me there. So, 3 out of 6 for character creation. Overall, it is a serviceable character creation system. It just seems quite a bit like a system for making a generic outlaw instead of a furry outlaw. Alright, so now that we have a character, what do they do? Furry Outlaws uses the halogen system. Yeah, system branding was something of a dumb trend in the 90s, and 2000s, and 2010s, and 2020s. And the big idea with the halogen system is that all tests are carried out by rolling a D100 against the sum of an attack and defense value, which, remember, we had to calculate earlier for all kinds of things. So if we wanted to, say, mix ourselves up a cocktail of recreational herbs, we would take our herbal alchemy attack value of 15, and as we will be ingesting the tonic ourselves, our poison defense of 25 for a total target of 40, and then roll against that with a D100, with success on a result equal to or over. Also, you may have noticed there that the alchemy check requires the poison defense of the target, so the roll has to be made when an alchemical agent is administered rather than made, which is a weird quirk of the system. Rolls are not and often cannot be made until the action's effects are determined rather than when the action is performed. But let's get a little more complicated here and say that while we were out gathering herbs, we ran afoul of a sinister ne'er-do-well who wants to relieve us of our overly complicated coin. Combat in Furry Outlaws is fucking weird, largely due to having one of the strangest initiative systems I have ever seen, in which you roll a die determined by the type of weapon you are using or other action you are taking, with movement and other basic tasks by default being a d6. So let's say that we are going to cast our invulnerability spell. That is from the alteration circle, which conveniently happens to be the only type of spell that can actually be used in combat and have an initiative of d10. Versus elemental and domination spells which take an entire minute to cast, or necromancy spells that take 10. So if we did try to cast lightning in combat, it would take anywhere from 20 to 60 rounds, because the initiative, as previously mentioned, is weird. And necromancy spells take so long to cast that the description of the harming spell literally says it takes so long that you really should use a dagger instead. So damaging magic is pretty much useless, until later levels when it becomes overpowered because you can store spells and special items and then recall them with a D10 initiative and no mana cost. And our little friend here is wielding a dagger, which has an initiative of a D4. So, you may have already guessed that initiative goes in order of low to high, but here is where it gets weird. Since we have the largest initiative die at a D10, that sets the actual length of the round at 10 ticks, which are a quarter of a second each. So this round will last 2.5 seconds, hence the 20 to 60 rounds in a minute. However, since the mouse has an initiative of D4, that means she acts every 4 ticks, and actually gets to roll a second initiative for ticks 5 through 8. And since there are still 2 ticks left in the round, she also gets to roll for a third initiative, but only gets an extra attack on a result of 1 or 2. So that is the initiative for the round. We will act on the 4th tick, and the mouse on the 1st and 6th, but not the 12th, because that falls outside the range of the largest single die. Basically, as long as any other character in the combat has a larger initiative die than you, you have the potential to get 2 or even 3 attacks per round. And speaking of multiple attacks per round, wanna hear about dual wielding? Of course you do. When wielding 2 weapons, you have 1 initiative per weapon. However, weapons also have a special second initiative and damage values for dual wielding. So if our guest had come at us with a dagger and a short sword, that would be an initiative of a D6 for the dagger and D8 for the short sword, both of which are rolled at the same time, and then of course a second roll made for each weapon because they are both within the range of that D10. And if you are sufficiently D&D poisoned, your exploit detection system has likely been activated here, and you're wondering if that means that you can have one party member take a D12 initiative weapon to intentionally maximize the round length to give a dual dagger wielder a guaranteed 4 attacks per round. And yes you can. It might not always work in your favor, but that is definitely the way the system works. And with all that information on the initiative system, you might be wondering, can I perform multiple different actions in the same round? Like, let's say that you needed to run up to someone before you could attack them. Would you be able to close in with a D6 initiative and then in the remaining 4 ticks make a dagger attack? And I don't think the book really addresses that, but I don't see why not. So that basically covers initiative, meaning that we can finally get to the actual combat mechanics. So first tick, and Mousy gets to stab in, adding her dagger skill of 10 and our unarmed defense of 33 for a total of 43. Then she rolls and hits, and for a character with strength 13 to 18, a dagger deals 1d5 damage. And that is another thing. You may have noticed that this game somewhat heavily uses D2s and D3s, which, yeah, nothing really remarkable there, but also D5s and D15s, which are, let's just say, less common. And I do have some thoughts on how they handled that, or rather didn't handle it, but that is critique for a later section of the video. And as long as I am here talking about damage, the reason that there are 2 damage values for every weapon is because that is lethal and stun, or non-lethal damage. And you may also be noticing that damage values are not provided at some strength scores for some weapons, which presumably means that characters with that low of a strength score just cannot wield those weapons. And this is also where that thing I said about not taking scores below 7 into account comes into play. The lowest strength score listed is 7, so I guess characters with strength of 6 or lower just cannot wield any weapons. And we are almost ready to apply that damage, but before doing so, we need to roll a hit location. And right leg, lower thigh. And then if we were wearing armor, the GM would use that hit location to determine if the specific body part targeted was covered by the armor. And armor will also be explained later. So a d5, which I don't have on hand, so roll a d10 and subtract 5 if the result is over 5 for 3 damage, which is then deducted from our hit points. And of course, for more information on rolling weird dice with normal dice, check out The Goblin Guide to Advanced Dice Rolling. Yeah, sorry, I'm just gonna start plugging that every time I do one of these weird die rolls now. Then tick 2, nothing happens, tick 3, nothing happens, and in tick 4, we cast Invulnerability at level 4. We could cast it at a lower level if we wanted to, but why not go all out? And casting a level 4 spell costs 10 mana points, as determined by the standard adjust table. So we take our invulnerability attack score of 11, plus a default magic defense of 10. We could use our magic defense of 50 here, but don't want to resist the spell, so we won't. And succeed. And invulnerability bestows upon us invisible, non-encumbering magic armor, with a value determined by the standard die table, which is used to determine pretty much all of the variable spell effects. So those elemental spells that take a whole minute to cast that I mentioned earlier also deal 1d2 damage at level 1. And at level 4, we gain d8 armor, which lasts for a mere 1 minute. So if we wanted to get really pedantic about this, we could say that we now need to start tracking 240 ticks, or like 30 rounds assuming an average d8 initiative, or honestly just kind of assume that combat isn't going to last long enough to bother tracking it, but that option isn't nearly as funny. And I should mention that there is another way to speed up the casting of spells. By doubling the mana cost, you can also half the casting time, presumably multiple times as it specifies a minimum of 1 tick. So we could have cast the spell with a d5 initiative for 20 mana points. Or if we did want to cast level 1 lightning in a single round, we could do so in 8 ticks for the low cost of 32 mana points for 1d2 damage. So 2 more ticks, and now it is time for the mouse's second attack. Once again rolling versus 43, and hit for 2 damage to the front right upper torso, which is completely negated by our magic armor. Then the last 3 ticks pass without incident, and on to round 2. So now we are ready to just hit the fiend with our staff, which as a large pull has an initiative of a d8. However, as we are not really looking to kill this poor misguided youth, just teach him a bit of a lesson, we are going to hit to stun, which deals stun damage instead of lethal damage. So we roll our initiative, and 6. And you might be wondering about those 2 ticks that were left over from the mouse's initiative in the previous round, and if they are going to carry over into this round. And no, but let's be honest here, you were seeing that as a possibility. And the mouse rolls for 3 and 1, with no opportunity for a third attack this time because the largest initiative die is now a d8. So nothing, and attack. But now we are engaged in melee, so the attack is made versus our pull weapon skill defense instead of unarmed defense, which is actually only 1 point higher. So 44, and still hits for 5 damage to the left hand, which once again is reduced by armor to 0. Then nothing, then the mouse gets to attack again, and misses. And then it is bonking time. So we take our pull weapon skill attack of 15, plus the target's dagger defense of 50, for a total target of 65. And hit. And at strength 26, a large pull deals 1d10 damage, or 1d12 stun, which is the type of damage we are inflicting. But also, because the roll was 20 or more higher than the target, it is also a double effect, which inflicts twice normal weapon damage, although it is not clear if twice normal weapon damage means 1d12 times 2, 2d12, or, 1d24. Either way, 16 damage to the top of the head, which is not covered by her pathetic leather jerkin, so no reduction. And notably, if this were lethal damage, that double hit would also be a crippling wound, which would have some permanent effect. But with stun, it's just a good bonk on the noggin, maybe a light concussion. However, as the attack did deal more than half her total hit points damage, she is also stunned for the remainder of this round and the next. But after a whack like that, I don't think we need to worry about her continuing the fight once she comes back to her senses, lest we discipline her further with our large pole. So this fight is basically over, and we could spend 10 minutes casting level 3 healing to restore 1d6 hit points, but I have a feeling that if there is one thing you are still waiting for me to explain, it is the healing attack. So basically, for each 12 hours of rest, we can roll to heal, which is of course done with our healing attack, plus a difficulty factor set by the GM and, let's just say, 10. Although that value can reasonably get into the 70s if you want to be a dick about it. And success on that heals 1d3 damage, or 1d6 damage on a double effect, which, remember, is exceeding the target by 20 or more. Or 1d10 on a triple effect, which is exceeding the target by 50 or more. Because, a d15, that is a normal thing that everyone has and uses all the time, but a d9? Don't be ridiculous. So that's basically it for mechanics, and once again, why don't I start by being nice? So there are things that I like here, not things that I think are okay, things that I genuinely like the different lethal and stun damage for the various weapon types. I think that's a really cool way to handle the fact that, yeah, you're going to do a lot more damage with a sword, but it's going to be much harder to knock someone out than with a staff. Also, just in general, I like the abstract weapon system. I like having dagger, small sword, medium sword, heavy sword, etc., because, let's be honest here, no game needs 12 different one-handed swords. No, not even the one you're thinking about. No, not that one either. Listen, no game needs 12 one-handed swords. Also, the rolled damage reduction for the armor, I really like that because damage reduction has a tendency to be either overpowered if it's too high or worthless if it's too low. But here, even with a dagger, you can still bypass armor. You can still get that lucky shot, but it's just not as likely. Hell, in theory, in the abstract, I even like the initiative system. Although I assume that after using it for several games and several combat encounters with 4 characters and who knows how many enemies, I would like it significantly less, but in the abstract I like the idea of it. It is a neat way to handle some characters just being faster than others. And just for the overall system, I very much understand what the idea was. I get what they were going for. Everything is handled with that same D100 versus attack plus defense value. It is very simple and unified. All those numbers are generated by the standard adjust table or the standard die table. It is a lot of everything runs through a very small set of core mechanics. And it's not bad per se, it's just that when I see subtract the sum of value 1 and value 2 from 50 to get value A, and then add value 3 and 4 to 10 to get value B, then add values A and B to get value C, and then roll against value C, I can't help but wonder why I'm not just adding values 1 and 2 to my roll versus values 3 and 4 plus 60. And if those numbers are too high, you can just subtract an equal number from both sides. It's not like this game doesn't already have negative values. It just seems like their attempt at simplifying the basic roll plus modifier versus target system is actually making it more complicated. Because like a lot of other stuff here, in the pure abstract hypothetical, it is simpler, where you're just rolling a die versus this one value to determine the failure or success of any task, as long as that value just kind of happens to exist. But it doesn't just exist, you have to calculate that value for every roll. So unless the GM is keeping track of everyone's attack and defense values for all of their skills and other abilities, which is a whole other situation, the player is still going to have to give their attack or defense value to the GM, and then someone is going to have to add those values together and roll a die against it. It is basically the same as if you were playing D&D, and instead of rolling your die and adding your modifier and then just giving that total to the GM had you give them your roll and modifier separately, then subtracted the modifier from the DC, and then used that as the target for the roll, and somehow decided that that was a better system. Also, balance is a bit of an issue here. Like, I had 2 level 5 characters fighting in the example, who had a 21-point discrepancy in their attack values. And yeah, a large part of that discrepancy is up to their agility scores, which, incidentally, I did not modify beyond the size modifiers, but also a lot of it is coming from the 1 level discrepancy in their weapon skills. And because of the way that bonuses compound as you move upwards, even a 1 level difference between combat skill abilities is just going to keep widening that gap. So, 3 out of 6 for mechanics. There are things I like here, things that make me go, ooh, that's really interesting, and the system works, and more importantly, it does the thing that it is supposed to do, but it doesn't make me feel excited about playing this game, much less I would really like to play the system, and more, I suppose I could put up with the system if I had to. So this game is from 1995 and reads like it's from 1995. There is something of an attempt to be overly technical while also managing to fail to explain some basic things. You may have noticed that all of the tables don't actually have D whatever dice notation. They just say 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And at no point does the game ever stop and say, oh, by the way, these are dice values. And also, you may have noticed that we're using D5s and D15s, so here's how you might want to deal with that, because I will tell you this, as something of a dice nerd, there is no convenient way to roll a D15 unless you have a D15. Okay, I guess like if you had a D6 and D10 table to generate a value from 1 to 15, that would be kind of convenient, but that is the most convenient way to roll a D15. Also, a lot of the information is very distributed throughout the book. Like, there is no section that ever says, here is how you make an attack roll, and then apply damage, and then reduce the damage by armor, and do that sort of thing. All of that information is more or less there in the book, but you have to hunt around for it and make a few assumptions yourself. So, no adjustment for writing. Some things are poorly explained or fairly non-intuitive, and it can be a chore sometimes to find information you're looking for without having to just skim through entire chapters to find it. But let's be honest here, when it comes to TTRPG writing, that was kind of the standard until like the mid-2000s, so I can't really fault books too much for being on the level with the same things you were getting from everyone else. And also, no adjustment for content. There is some content, there is a lot of focus on the setting, there are some NPCs, as I mentioned, information on dragons and undead, but you might notice that I keep specifically mentioning dragons and undead because those are the only real monsters that are addressed. And just overall, there is an amount of content, but I feel like if I were to run this game, I would still need to make the majority of content myself, while also ignoring large amounts of the content that is provided. It is very much, this is the stuff that you will need for the game that we want you to play, and if you go outside of that, you're on your own. So, as I keep saying, this book is from 1995. And yeah, it does look a bit like it's from 1985. Just more or less all of the text poured into a single column flowing across various pages, with a little bit of attention paid to the headings and sections and even sometimes page breaks. Also, a lot of the positioning of like tables and illustrations and such does feel very intentional. So clearly they were trying to make it look good. And also, as this is a furry role-playing game, as you might expect, there is quite a bit of furry art, which is fairly well done and used throughout the book. Although, to continue harping on this one particular detail, fortunately though, the art does not feature furries with fingernails, because that is not a thing that I want to see. So, 3 out of 6 for presentation. It is not top of the line now, it was not top of the line at the time, but let's be honest, it does look a lot better than a lot of the stuff that I do see now when people have free access to significantly better tools than what was available to the top publishers at the time. And that was Furry Outlaws, a game that is fine, I guess. The thing is that this game keeps giving me a very familiar feeling. Like, it feels very similar to a lot of games that I see nowadays in a very specific and not very good way. Basically, if this game had come out today and I had no additional context, I would just assume that someone had taken a pre-existing system and used it to make a furry historical fantasy role-playing game. Like, it constantly feels like the game is struggling against the restraints of the system, and all they're really doing is trying to make excuses for it rather than fix it. Like, oh, it sure would be difficult to implement unique animal abilities for the characters. Good thing they don't have any. Oh, some of these spells are a bit overpowered in combat. Well, sure is fortunate that they take a minute to cast. Like, right down to including a spell and saying in the description of that spell that it is basically useless. But as far as I can tell, that is not the case. The halogen system does not seem to have existed prior to Furry Outlaws, and was only used in Furry Outlaws and Furry Pirates. Like, it feels much more like this game was made to use the halogen system than it was a system that was developed for the specific needs of this game. Like, as I've been saying throughout most of this video, overall it is a fine historical fantasy role-playing game. Unfortunately, it's supposed to be a furry historical fantasy role-playing game. But as I also have said before, it feels like removing that furry aspect from the game would be incredibly easy. And if you can remove one of the core aspects of the game without really affecting the rest of it, your game might need some more work. And I feel like I'm being a bit mean here and making it seem like this is a terrible game. It's not a terrible game. It is a fine game. If you wanted to play a medieval fantasy furry role-playing game, and it was 1995 through 1998, so Ironclaw wasn't an option, this would fill that need very nicely. But as I keep saying, it does feel just more like a reskin of a generic system than it does a game built to provide a specific and unique experience. And is it worth checking out for the historical significance in both furry and tabletop role-playing games? Yes, if you have no other reason to look at this game, that is a really good reason to look at this game. Hell, I'm making a whole video about this game for that reason. And you know what? If you check it out, maybe you'll like it more than I do. That is a possibility that I hope is true with all of my videos. But just for me personally, overall it feels like this game doesn't have much to offer that hasn't since been done better, or at the very least, done in better games. And thank you for watching. If you enjoy the wacky things I say and do, you can follow me on Blue Sky and/or Tumblr. You can also join me live on Twitch, where sometimes things get a little weird. And extra special thanks to my Fightin' Flail Snails, Broken Unicorn, D-Stex, Nikolai Snowtail, Puggo, Randy Mulholland, Renee D, Stephen Kramer, Teela Glar, Toshiro Kuro, and Tyro the Fox. If you want to be cool like them, check out my Patreon or YouTube channel memberships. Two different things that provide similar but distinct benefits. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos that have mysteriously manifested from the ethers, which I am sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.